Oh, yeah. We
Yeah.
were just saying that our reptilian overlords had crashed your router.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think
Yeah.
the red raptors are descending on us, not the blue, not the good blue raptors.
Yeah, definitely the Martian Raptors for
Yeah.
sure. Um, yeah, I was like, are we frozen? Or are you guys just really into this story? Um,
Both was the answer.
The New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast, featuring your hosts, Gabe Reineck and Ken Holyoke.
Welcome back to the Brother Archaeology Podcast. I'm Gabe Riding in Fredericton, New Brunswick, and I'm joined, as I am every fortnight, by Ken Holyoke there in Lethbridge, Alberta. How are you, Ken?
Well, Gabe, I am looking out the window at some snow, and I will warn the listener that we are delving into the first of a two-part episode on pseudoarchaeology, and one of our co-hosts is perpetuating a myth as we speak. He is coming to you live not from Fredericton. He is coming to you live from his office in New Hampshire. And Gabe, I am shocked. I'm shocked that you would do something like this to our listener.
Ken, this is just a simulacrum. I don't know what the problem is. You think it's pseudoarchaeology. I think it's savvy archaeological theory. And as the listener will know, at some point, either in the future, in the past, even knows what it is anymore, that you're a Time Lord. So there's no possibility that that we've stepped outside of the time-space continuum here. But we've got a very special show for the listener today about, as you mentioned, pseudoarchaeology. And we are sponsored, as we are, by the Association of this P. It's a sneaky P, I think they call it, but it's not for pseudo, it's for professional in this case,
That is
Archaeologists of New
correct.
Brunswick.
Yeah.
And we thank them very much for their sponsorship. Ken, if the listener wanted to think about a way to rename this podcast and rename this podcast in a way that there's nothing pseudo about it, just like a real bona fide new name for this podcast that didn't invoke, aliens or Atlantis or space lasers or anything like that. Where would they email that name to?
They would send it to the 100% truth verified, truth social perpetuated, New Brunswick Archaeology at gmail.com. Maybe Truth Social, not verified. It's verified on X. I guess they get the blue check mark on that one.
Yeah,
New
we're
Brunswick
not on X,
Archaeology.
listener.
No, we're not actually.
Or
New
True
Brunswick
Social, actually, we should mention just for the sake of discussion.
New Brunswick Archaeology at gmail.com. That's archaeology spelled ARCHAEOLOGY. New Brunswick Archaeology at gmail.com. And actually looking into the listener mail right now in that email address, before we get to our prize read this week, we do have one piece of listener mail. And I've lost it. There we go. And it's from our frequent listener, Wally. And it says on that VT Rama points. So talking about Vermont Rama points.
I
Dear Ken
think
and
that
Gabe,
the Hanley projectile, it looks fluted. Hanley projectile point from Vermont. So was that with Matt? We talked about that, right?
yeah. So dear Ken and Gabe, great new episode as always. It's always heartening to hear that not all the big questions have been answered yet. I hope you do invite Matt Betts back for another guest episode soon, and we hope he will be back as well.
Indeed.
I was surprised to hear, though, that Gabe couldn't remember where in Vermont the Rama Point Paleo Point comes from, considering Loring's 60-ish page article about it is an assigned reading in one of his courses. For the record, it was found by a Milton-based collector somewhere in northern Vermont. Today, the point is housed in the Smithsonian, but there's a nice cast of it at Echo in Burlington. What is Echo?
Oh, cool. I don't know.
Something. So, Wally, if you want to write back, you can tell us what Echo is in Burlington. Yeah.
The thing the listener should know about Wally is that Wally is the kind of student that actually reads all 60 pages of a 60-page article about Vermont archaeology and then remembers them in slavish detail. So thank you, Wally.
And so So Gabe, in the spirit of the season, this episode will be dropping as we lead into the Halloween kind of
Oh, so Ken, I
weekend.
don't think I tipped off the listener on why we're doing this, which is that if they rename the podcast.
Yeah. If they rename the podcast, this is the prize that they could be in store for.
Yeah, well, we did this in a weird order because we're in the time-space continuum, and so you sort of cut in on the listener mail, which ordinarily I introduce, but that's okay.
Yeah, we're all shook up here.
Yeah, my feelings are not hurt. It's because we're doing these things in the wrong order, listener, but stay cool. Everything's fine.
If the listener doesn't realize that Gabe and I actually had a conversation before we went to air, that the way in which we have scheduled these interviews and recording the preamble as post hoc has actually caused confusion in both our schedules and how we present the flow of the information to you, listener. And so if things
we're doing the preamble as post-amble, actually, is the confusion here. So, but ordinarily, Ken, I would say something about and where would the listener send that prize-winning new name for this podcast? And you would say
New Brunswick Archaeology at gmail.com.
But since we're working backwards, what I'm instead going to say is the listener might notice that we still do not have a new name for this podcast. If they had that new name, Ken, where would they send it?
New Brunswick Archaeology at gmail.com.
And if they were the lucky prize winner this week, Ken, what would they win?
Well, so it's in the spirit of the season, Gabe, as we head into the Halloween weekend. We have both
season, which is the holiest of seasons among anthropology undergraduates, I've learned.
Exactly. We have both a trick and a treat for you tonight, listener. So Gabe, do you like to dress up? And for Halloween, Gabe, this is a family program. Let's
well, Ken, I don't think I've dressed up for Halloween since I went as Alden Nolan that one year you and I ended up at the very weird Christmas party as graduate students near the university.
Well, you're gonna have to don your field regalia and doff your fedora. Because we're going to be setting off with one lucky listener on an adventure into an evening filled with treats while we explore the downtown Platte of historic Fredericton.
No kidding.
Yes, listener, you're going to prepare your adventurous soul as we learn about the long history of the city itself, some of the recent archaeology that's gone on downtown, and descend into the mysterious histories and stories that shape what your capital city is today. Yes, Indiana Jones and Indiana Jones will have a canvas crossbody of goodies to keep you sated throughout the evening. But as we wind our way up the hill, the trick is going to come at you. Stark reality is going to set in, and after that long, enjoyable day in the field, we'll be sitting down to the real job of the archaeologist that they don't show on TV, where for the next 8 hours, you'll be finishing up the drawing that you started. You're going to finalize your notes for the day. You're then going to decipher the field notes of a student from an excavation 50 years ago. You're going to correlate some bags with worn labels and shaky provenience, drawings smeared by water and the occasional blood of mosquito, and most horrific of all, unpacking, cleaning, and organizing the 8,000 nails recovered from a mid-19th century barn, now in various stages of oxidation. This prize package will bring you all the joys of deciphering a Grail diary and leave you wishing for a Kali Ma of your own, if you can name the New Brunswick Archaeology podcast.
That's right, listener. You thought only Indiana Jones could be heartless, but also the prizes on this podcast can be heartless. And so, Ken, for the 18th time this intro, since we're all discombobulated, where would the lucky listener send the win to finally find themselves on the Fredericton Platte sorting nails?
New Brunswick Archaeology at gmail.com. That is New Brunswick Archaeology, archaeology spelled ARCHAEOLOGY. New Brunswick Archaeology at gmail.com.
That's right, listener. FCIC approved. Some restrictions may apply. And we are told also that there is still some Eco4 money left on the table, as they say in Atlantic City. Our friend Trevor Dow has let us know that there are still there's a third prize draw that's still available for a listener who fills out a New Brunswick Archaeology podcast bingo card.
Yep.
With the, according to like bingo rules, you need the, all on a line or blackout. And if you submit those, we'll enter you into a draw for, I think, the last Eco4 swag.
Yeah. And
We've
hopefully
had a
more
couple
swag
of
to
lucky
come
winners.
sometime soon. And so I
Yeah,
think the listener, if you go to our Instagram page, maybe we will repost that those bingo cards or the link to them. And you can have an opportunity, or you can reach out to us and we will email you a copy of a bingo card. And you can go back through the back catalog now of 20 plus episodes of the New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast, and pick up on all of those bingo cues.
that's right. And the listener will notice that Ken and I have gone through this first this intro in somewhat bewilderment, because you used to do these as if time were a straight arrow. And since we're not doing that, now that time is not a straight arrow, one of the things that we just sort of wanted to thank you for was we really appreciate that all of you have tuned in for our first 20 episodes. It's been a lot of fun for Ken and me. And one of the things that we've actually really appreciated is our interaction with you via email or via Instagram. And so it's been kind of a thrill to just get to know folks, or even to run into people and find out that they're listeners of the podcast. So thanks. We really appreciate it. And we would also love to hear more about what you want to hear on the podcast.
Yeah, we would love to hear from you. You can send us emails. You can send us messages. I think you could probably direct message you can slide into our DMs on Instagram, or even comment on any of our posts. And we're happy to, as you can probably guess, we have a number of sort of ideas for themes and guests that we want to get on the show. You maybe know an archaeologist that you'd like to hear talk about a particular topic. You may want to hear us just talk about a particular topic again. And we kind of drove through all the culture history last season, but what the listener may have picked up on in those 2-hour plus episodes is that Gabe and I scratch the surface and thoroughly enjoy talking about these topics. And so it's always fun for us to revisit that, particularly in the light of, both of us doing ongoing research, and maybe be able to add new pieces into that as we can see with the sort of the hot production in Northeast publication this fall too, that there's new pieces always being added to this puzzle.
Yeah, that's right, listener. I scratched the surface. Ken XRF's the surface, and he has just tipped off that we're about to have another weird time travel moment, because we need to do hit pieces on not the episode we've just introduced, but on a different episode.
No, it's this episode.
Oh, is it? Oh, yeah, it is.
Yeah, it is this episode.
Are you sure?
It is.
So what hit piece? Okay, fantastic. Well, listener, Ken is about to climb into that time load machine.
We should probably tell the listener what they're getting in for. It's so upcoming. Upcoming, we have an interview with Stephanie Halmhofer, who's an expert on pseudoarchaeology, and as we hinted at the start of this episode, this is the first of a 2-part. Which may become 3 parts, but at this point it is a 2-part episode on pseudoarchaeology, where this episode we're going to be talking broadly about what pseudoarchaeology is, some of the strategies that you can use to combat it, and sort of inform people about if they've engaged with pseudoarchaeology, or if they're sort of exposed to it, and importantly too, we talk about Brother XII. Sort of a unique example of a pseudoarchaeological past having real archaeology applied to it today in Stephanie's own research, and then and we'll be following that up with some closer to home pseudoarchaeology cases in the next fortnight.
That's right. We'll have Daryl Kelman on about Oak Island.
Yeah. So
that's right, listener. Now that we're resituated in time, Ken's gonna make that swooshing sound that he often makes, and we're gonna disappear. Dun, 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 dun.
Welcome back, listener. And I guess we're not welcoming you back. You've been here the whole time. We are still on the radio. You did not just jump forward and jump backwards in time, and we are joined.
But don't touch that dial.
Exactly. We are joined tonight by PhD student, University of Alberta graduate student, Stephanie Halmhofer, who's joining us from British Columbia. Is that correct?
That is, yep, south coast of BC.
Yeah, so we're coast to coast tonight on your listening dial. And so Stephanie is a PhD student in the Department of Anthropology at University of Alberta. She's an affiliate of the Institute of Prairie Indigenous Archaeology. Stephanie and I go back to the Northwest Coast Lab in the northwest corner of the 5th floor at U of T, where she was finishing up her master's degree with Gary Copeland, and I was just starting my PhD. She has a background in bioarchaeology, and her MA was on a fur trade archaeology site that was a burial on the West Coast in the Sunshine Coast area, specifically glass beads from a burial context. And your current PhD project is centered on pseudoarchaeology, the far right, and a character who I was unfamiliar with until today named Brother XII, who we're going to come back to later in the interview. And I think she's piqued our interest, both Gabe and I. So Stephanie has published.
Yeah, I certainly spent a while online checking this out after hearing about this.
We've exhausted our Google searches, so now we need to go to the source. Stephanie's published in the International Journal of Cultural Property, Unbound, a journal of digital scholarship, the SAA Archaeological Record, Sapiens magazine, which is a Wenner-Gren Foundation magazine, and in Science as well. She also maintains the Bones, Stones, and Books website. She has a blog and Twitter account, which we will promo towards the end of the show, but she can be found, I guess, it's called X now, at cult_archaeo. And her website is bonesstonesandbooks.com. And I don't think this is by a long shot your first podcast. You've been a contributor to CBC and a bunch of other shows, and you're doing the circuit talking about pseudoarchaeology and the dark places on the internet that archaeology sometimes goes. So welcome to the show, Stephanie, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me on to talk about what I call the archaeology of highly cursed content in the very dark places on the internet. Absolutely. Which has nothing to do with my master's degree at all, which was, looking at blown glass beads. I have yet to come across any pseudoarchaeological theories involving blown glass beads. So there's still time.
There's still
Small
time.
Blessings indeed. Yeah. We appreciate you coming on.
Well, thank you very much for having me and for listing all these things that I've done. That makes me sound really cool, and I really appreciate that.
Hey, we were completely impressed. We also got a little bit nervous when we saw your podcast record. We were like, like she's going to listen back to the show and realize we just don't do this right, do we?
Yeah, but we also thought, well, maybe she can help us with some tips on how to set our microphones correctly. We
have this ongoing issue where we don't really know what gain does, but it made the Gabe's headphones so loud on our last episode.
Oh, no.
He couldn't hear me talking, and in a rare occasion he was talking over me, which never happens. So that's we'll try to minimize that tonight.
Yeah, but I'm gonna seize a quick opportunity here, Stephanie. So I think one of the things that we wanted to ask you about, which is to sort of start off with what is pseudoarchaeology and how does it distinguish itself from just archaeology that's incorrect or otherwise wrong?
Right. Yeah. Because, miscorrect or incorrect archaeology or misrepresentations or misinterpretations, it happens. Right. And we learn and we, move on as we have more information. So I think that's a really good question, is what distinguishes pseudoarch from just general misinterpretations. For a long time, people have been talking about pseudoarch for a long time, for several decades, and they've kind of come up with this list of various characteristics that define it. And for me personally, because of course, as archaeologists, we can't agree on just one thing. So for me personally, I sort of took together, I'm just scrolling up to my actual thing here so I don't mess up my own thing. I took a bunch of different characteristics developed by archaeologists long before I did. And I also started to notice that there's like a really strong conspiratorial element to pseudoarchaeology. And that, to me, at least, is the most important characteristic, is the most defining characteristic. Misinterpretations happen. But if you start saying that, instead of, taking responsibility, like, I misinterpreted, there's new evidence. If you start suddenly saying, well, no, somebody's actually hiding the truth and they're suppressing this and they don't want this to get out, that's something different than a misrepresentation or a misinterpretation. So to me, at least, pseudoarchaeology, I define it as being speculative and alternative claims made about human history that use archaeological knowledge. They use bits and pieces of facts, But they rely on a matter of faith rather than a matter of proof. And they willfully and they deliberately downplay any sort of contradictory archaeological knowledge under this guise of something called stigmatized knowledge. That's something that comes from Michael Barkin, a political scientist, which is what sort of places pseudoarchaeology into the same realm as conspiracy theories. So for me, at least, that conspiratorial element is the most important characteristic, and it sort of also helps explain why we see pseudoarch popping into a lot of other very conspiratorial spaces, like QAnon or old-fashioned New World Order conspiracy theories, that kind of thing.
So you had mentioned stigmatized knowledge. And so could you sort of build on that? What exactly is stigmatized knowledge? And I know the example that you gave us, you used QAnon as sort of a perfect example of what stigmatized knowledge is.
Yeah, stigmatized knowledge. So it comes from this political scientist, Michael Barkin, who sort of he started to notice that conspiracy theories were becoming linked with seemingly very disconnected things like New Age spirituality and very radical political ideologies, and all sorts of things were kind of all coming together into these globs of things. And so he started looking for ways to explain it. He came up with this idea of the stigmatized knowledge claims. So stigmatized knowledge claims are claims of truth, or what the claimants say are true, despite not being verified by knowledge validating institutions. So like a university or museum or some other scientific body is like, actually, that's not true. The claimants will say it's true and then say that they are being, suppressed or ignored or all sorts of stuff. It's a very basic form of conspiracy theory itself, this skepticism of these knowledge validating institutions. And there's 5 different types that Barkin identified. There's forgotten knowledge. So that's like claims of, we've forgotten this knowledge that came to us from Atlantis over time.
Right.
Superseded knowledge. So claims once recognized as knowledge, but they've since become regarded as false. Ignored knowledge, rejected, and then the classic all-encompassing suppressed knowledge. And you see elements of this in pretty much every pseudoarchaeological claim. Those are the claims that archaeologists are hiding the truth or ignoring things because we're protecting our reputation or whatever.
This is when you lean into the microphone really closely and go, "This is how you do your own research."
Yes, exactly. And yeah, like QAnon is a very good example of this sort of all-encompassing, this movement. They've drawn in elements from so many different places, and there's sub-communities of QAnon too. So they've got their very core belief in this deep state cabal of satanic elites that eat children and drain them of adrenochrome. But then there's all these other things that go into that as well. And that's where you see the different sub-communities pop up. And a really, really big sub-community is what this one researcher called the Q Age, which is a play on New Age. And that's where we see a lot of the pseudoarch in particular popping up. They're very much into mostly ancient aliens type of stuff. They're all into galactic federations, and star seeds is a term, a thing. So there's a lot of the ancient alien stuff drawn in there, but also a lot of Atlantis stuff as well, because this idea of ancient wisdoms is very important to New Age spirituality, and Atlantis pops in there all the time. So there's a lot of pseudoarch in QAnon. If you look at these very popular visualizations, sometimes you see them being shared around on social media. It's this like wacky looking map with all these words and all these like arrows and everything connecting them. If you are willing to take a closer look at it, and I don't recommend anybody actually look at this map, but you will see elements of pseudoarch all over it that are tied to other things by arrows and lines and stuff. So yeah.
That's right, listener. Stephanie is subscribing to the high-end VPN, so you don't have to. So you can, you can protect your internet security and your algorithms.
That's right.
But one thing that you've mentioned here, so QAnon, I think is a very real thing, in the sense that it's at once a kind of online conspiracy. On the other hand, it's a man in a Viking helmet waving around a flagpole at a riot at the U.S. Capitol. And so one of the things I wonder is the degree to which these contemporary alt-right movements, and I think you've done some work on this, are drawing on these pseudoarchaeological theories.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, everybody kind of laughs at QAnon and thinks it's a very social media or internet based thing. And to some degree, it is still very internet based, but it does jump out of the internet. It does impact people's real lives, like we just sort of referenced the insurrection currently in Saskatchewan. Romana Didillo, I probably mispronounced her name. She's set herself up in this very small town, Saskatchewan, called Richmond.
Yeah.
She's
The
more
QAnon
popular
queen.
known as the exactly, the QAnon queen.
Right.
So she's taken over an empty school in this very tiny town, and she and her followers are really digging in deep over there. The more people from this town try to push them out, the more reluctant they are to leave. She is very into ancient alien and alien related stuff as well, as part of her whole QAnon thing. So it does impact people's real lives. And when it comes to the alt-right or the far right, archaeology is very powerful. It provides a very tangible connection to the past, and the past itself is also very powerful. People, a lot of the far right people that I read or written about, I should say, talk about the importance of knowing one's past to protect the future. And so to that, archaeology can provide a very tangible connection to the past. And if the archaeology doesn't support their ideologies, well, who cares? They can just write a new story for the archaeology. So archaeology becomes very powerful, and pseudoarchaeology is viewed as very legitimate, but stigmatized archaeology. So it's seen as it's somebody's actually, sharing some sort of truth, but the archaeologists just don't want to get that out. They want to block that from getting out, which itself becomes very powerful, and people are more attracted to that, essentially the thrill of the conspiracy type of thing. So pseudoarch provides kind of like a reinforcement type value to a lot of far right ideologies. Historical revisionism is one of the characteristics of the modern contemporary far right, and pseudoarchaeology is a part of that. And it acts sometimes as a recruitment tool as well. So one guy I'm writing about in this paper, who's just a terrible human being, he talks a lot about a particularly popular pseudoarchaeology proponent who has a Netflix show and has written many best-selling books. And this guy talks about how he uses that author's books to essentially draw more people into white supremacism, because as he sort of says, that this author essentially doesn't realize the messages that he's putting out that the far right are really attracted to. And that actually provides a really good avenue to attract people. It doesn't turn them off right away when they read this author's book. So this guy will be like, hey, you should read this book. And if somebody's like, well, this book has some really interesting ideas, he views it as another way to just keep drawing them in. And so pseudarch also has that value as well. It's very manipulative, and which is then when you see this content on things like Netflix or Discovery Channel, seems very goofy and very outlandish, and very silly. But when you know how it's viewed as valuable by the far right, then you start to question, why is Netflix or Discovery or History or YouTube even essentially spreading that? They're kind of blurring the lines between far right and non-far right sources transmitting the messages for the far right without even realizing it many times.
Yeah, and I mean, you raise a good point there too about like spreading on the internet, and Gabe had a question down here. What's the role of on the internet in pseudoarchaeology? But also, like, one of the things that I've been kind of curious about is like when we first posted our show, the first search result that comes up beside ours is Jordan Peterson's podcast, right? And so, like, one of the things that I think is really challenging about this is that on top of the far right sort of glomming onto these pseudoarchaeological narratives, there seems to be kind of an increasingly like right-leaning algorithm that's sort of driving people towards this. And so like jokingly, I kind of wrote down like how do you manage that, like researching this stuff, and like how do you sort of navigate that? But also like, do you see that like this sort of is like a snowball rolling, right? Like once somebody grabs onto this, you end up in these black holes, and how do you sort of manage to get out of those, and how do you talk to people about sort of countering that narrative, right?
Just to interrupt briefly, Ken, I'm a little embarrassed. You've discovered my all beef diet that led to the algorithm to produce that response. But
I was trying to think of why is your podcast appearing beside Jordan Peterson. Now it all makes sense.
Exactly. Yeah.
The other side note, very tragic thing about Brother 12 is he actually looks quite a bit like Jordan Peterson. So when I'm doing my Brother 12 stuff, I'm also thinking about Jordan Peterson, and it's just tragic on both fronts. The internet does play an interesting, actually the whole thing, this paper chapter that I'm just wrapping up right now that I told you about, it literally started with a Google search. And I started with a Google search for Atlantis because periodically I just search, pseudoarchaeological keywords, Atlantis being a very popular one, to see where does the internet direct me to. And I don't really like to use fancy coding things to get all these big, data sets, because I really am just interested in what the everyday person sees when they go onto Google and they type in Atlantis. What do they find? And from this simple Google search, I was directed to a gazillion far-right websites. And in many cases, you don't even realize necessarily that's where you're going. So this paper sort of starts with a particular YouTube video about Atlantis that I was like, what is this? And I clicked on it, and it had been posted on a far-right website. So I'm watching this YouTube video on this far-right website, which then got me thinking, well, where else is Atlantis popping up on it? And it just led down this very deep, dark, terrible rabbit hole into far worse places. So, and there's certain pseudo-archaeological theories or certain keywords too, where I know that is where it's going to direct me to. If you're going to search Solutrean hypothesis, put your safe search on, because if you do not put safe search on, you will end up in terrible places, because it's a very popular theory on the far right. Even on Twitter/X now, it's a terrible place right now, just with the changes that have been made. A lot of content that I was not seeing, that I would only see because I'd added it to special lists. You can create lists on Twitter where it's, I want to see stuff from these people in particular, so you turn on this list. I was not seeing content from any of those folks without this list on. And now every time I go onto Twitter, that's the first stuff I see. So the internet does play a pretty big role. It connects people to larger sources of data than they would have been connected to, or more areas, I should say, than they would have been connected to beforehand. Algorithms pick up on what you're sort of searching for, and they start to suggest things. Look at like YouTube. You search a video on YouTube. What are the recommended videos that pop up on the side? TikTok, even places like that. So the algorithms do play a big part, and that's where something called prebunking comes into effect or becomes more effective. Debunking is important. I'm not saying it's not important, but prebunking is a little bit better. Just giving people the tools ahead of time, letting people know what to look for. What are things that should be raising red flags? Yeah. What are questions that you should be asking when you come across certain things? Essentially, you're inoculating. It comes from inoculation theory. You're just preparing people for the content they might see, giving them tools to be able to sort of critically analyze it on their own and decide for themselves if they should look for more information. Maybe they should look for more information somewhere else, that kind of thing. That's a really important thing to do.
Could you run through a few of those maybe techniques for the non-professional archaeologist, or for the professional archaeologist looking to kind of help the non-professional archaeologist navigate the internet, basically, for these sorts of things?
Yeah, because I think the real danger here is that some of this could be you could get really wrapped up in this stuff very innocently. Like we had we had an open house at the start of the semester, and there was a student who's a new student at the university. And he was very excited to talk to us because he was taking some archaeology classes, and he clearly had some background information in archaeology. Then he started talking about, I can't remember what specifically it was. And we kind of had to say like, oh, well, you got to be really careful about those kinds of videos. And like, and he was like, oh, he's like, what do you mean? And we're kind of explaining that, like, that's not really based in fact. And you got to be really, kind of cautious about sort of where you're pulling your information on in archaeology. And he was like, oh, I hadn't really thought about that before. And so what are some, so as like Gabe said, what are some of the tools that you can kind of prepare people for to pre-bunk? I like that term.
Yeah. Pre-bunk, just being proactive rather than reactive, right? Yeah. When you start to learn about what the characteristics, or when you have like sort of a list, I always sort of set aside or have a list of what what defines something as being pseudoarchaeological. Have that prepared, and you teach that list to people. You teach them what are the characteristics of pseudoarchaeology. What does it actually look like? What does it sound like? Where are spaces that you might encounter it? Because then if people do come across it in a YouTube video or they come across it in a book, suddenly it's like, wait, this was on the list of things that maybe I should think twice about, take with a grain of salt. So just sort of teaching people how to identify something, like what does it look like? What are those key characteristics is really, really helpful. And then also sort of talking about different styles of how this information is presented. So there's a great paper I was reading not that long ago about the different types. There's these researchers identified sort of 3 types of conspiracy videos on YouTube. And one type, the exhibiting narrative style of YouTube video or of conspiracy video, is very common in pseudoarch. Those are those type of videos where it's like this rapid flash of all these different images where they don't spend much time on one image. They quickly move to the next and say, see, it looks the same. And then the narrator is, telling you the stories. They're flashing through all these images, not really giving you time to stop and actually look at things. So you're seeing these things, but you're being told a different narrative or told a narrative. And that narrative is helping you think about what you're seeing. So identifying what certain types of or popular types of sharing pseudoarchaeological content, like what do the videos look like, is also really useful. Again, the characteristics. So like telling people, at least for me, identifying what do conspiracist type statements look like? What do stigmatized knowledge statements look like? Because that should raise red flags in your mind. And then also,
and those are the statements that are like, the big archaeology does not want you to know. Those are those kinds of statements.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, dangerous
knowledge,
exactly. Like
yep, forbidden knowledge, or you're censoring me, blah blah blah.
The challenge with those ones though is like every documentary that's legitimate is like mysteries of the Maya and like mysteries of Chaco Canyon and like that sort of stuff, right? And so like even the stuff that has legitimate research in it is framed in that kind of same like grab your attention way. That's
It is. The headlines are kind of a pain in the butt, and the titles of things for sure. So yeah, the title of something might be off-putting, but then as you're listening to the researchers talk about it, are they bringing the researchers themselves or the talking heads themselves? Are they bringing up any of these characteristics or referencing any of these characteristics? And even just like thinking about how to prepare people for encountering it on social media. If people do go onto social media, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or TikTok or anything, learning about when is a good time to, or when should you react versus not react, because sometimes not reacting is the better option. And when you do react, there are better ways to react than other ways. And sort of teaching people how to, when you do encounter it, how do you react to it? What is a good way to react versus a not good way to react? Just things like that.
So that actually sort of segues to the question I've been maybe most excited to ask you. So I spent about a year living in West Virginia, and I was always struck by in any kind of social situation, eventually it often comes up what you do, and you can only lie and say you're a land surveyor for so long. And then eventually it becomes apparent that you're not a land surveyor because you're not very good at trigonometry. And then the person you're talking to says, and not a member of the alt-right or I think a malicious person at all will say, oh, have you seen the Oak Island TV show? And you can tell that they kind of know it's a guilty pleasure, and they kind of say, well, like, I know you're gonna think this is wrong, but I think they sort of also think, well, there must be some truth to this, right? But sure, it's sensationalized, but it's not bonkers, in the way that it actually is. And so how do you react? As a coward, I've always tended to react by sort of saying something like, well, actually the actual archaeology of Nova Scotia is so much more interesting, and that's a bunch of sort of like made up tales, but I don't know that that's effective, right? And I don't know that it's that effective against inoculating against these kind of bigger problems that pervade to whatever degree Oak Island might be a kind of gateway drug to many more
like malicious things, right?
Malicious or things that one might find on the Stormfront.
And what the listener what the listener doesn't know is that when Stephanie came on the call here, she held up a book on Oak Island. She knew who she was getting in with here, and
That's right.
And she brought the meat and potatoes basically to.
Absolutely. I anticipated Oak Island. I so rarely get to talk about Oak Island. I was like, now's my chance.
We work niche on this podcast. Don't worry.
Yeah, it's first to preface, yeah, definitely not everyone who's into this stuff is like a far right neo-Nazi. We just have to ask, why are neo-Nazis so into this stuff? That's something to think about too. But yeah, definitely I do encounter people like that for sure, who are just like innocently interested and to some degree, I think it reflects to access to archaeology. There's so much archaeological knowledge out there, but so much of it also, inaccessible to the everyday persons behind all these paywalls. Doesn't mean there's nothing out there. There's great blogs out there. There are great YouTube videos. There are excellent TikTok channels. The information's out there. But yeah, I do often encounter people who will be like, Graham Hancock raises some good points. Have you read any of Graham Hancock's stuff before? Or yeah, Oak Island. What do you think about Oak Island? I think that's pretty interesting and stuff like that. And you sort of can gauge a little bit right off the front or right at the beginning how sincere they are. Some people do just want to argue and be contrarian and sea lion you, and you're not going to get through to people like that. But if somebody is very just genuinely interested and they raise an incorrect point, even just saying something very simple as like, well, that's not entirely correct. Or, that's, taken a little bit out of context. Those sort of little friendly slide-ins are actually quite effective. That was another paper I was reading recently about how literally just saying, hey, dude, you're not entirely, or that's not entirely correct is actually a really good opener, and people do tend to listen. And then, yeah, just totally geek out about the actual archaeology. When you start to show your passion, your interest, then a lot of people are suddenly like, oh, you guys are just dorks. Like, you're not trying to hide anything. You're like telling me about this tiny sherd of pottery. Like, what the heck? So yeah, just looking for those little openings and explaining. I tend to talk a lot about the importance of context because, context in archaeology is highly important. It's pretty much everything. And when you start to explain the importance of context and then give examples of how something, somebody might be saying something that's factually true, but when it's removed from its context and inserted into a different context, that's when the problems start. And when you give examples of what that looks like, that's also really helpful, especially when you have sources you can direct people to as well. If there's a really good blog where you're like, hey, if you're interested in this, you should go check out so-and-so's blog, or, oh, have you read this book, or have you seen this YouTube video, like stuff like that. Just offering sources is really helpful, and being patient as well. Patience is a very undervalued skill, but being patient and having just a very calm, friendly conversation, being willing to have a conversation more than once, perhaps if it's somebody who, a friend or somebody you see regularly, that also really helps. Recognizing sometimes that's hard to be patient.
Yeah, the listener can't see Gabe wincing right now. It's the
friends. Yeah, but so one of the things that I wanted to build on that though is, so to what degree you talked about this idea of stigmatized knowledge. So if I'm at a dinner party with someone, and again we're still talking about, we're going to move into the darker corners of this, I think, unfortunately soon, but and I say, well, actually I'm an archaeologist and I can sort of tell you, that these are the problems. To what degree does that lean into this idea of these stigmatized knowledge claims of, oh yeah, these archaeologists, well, of course you wouldn't believe that because you're an archaeologist and you're part of big archaeology and you're here to squash the conspiracy.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. In stigmatized knowledge, yeah, any attempt to correct information is sort of seen as proof of truthfulness, right? Like these things resist falsification by always twisting something to be proof of the conspiracy. So absolutely, as soon as we start confronting and trying to sort of, I hate using the word correct, but I can't think of a better word to use, but correct the misinformation. That depending on who you're talking to, that can definitely be taken as more signifier of the truthfulness of this conspiracy. But that's where, yeah, you'll generally figure out pretty quickly When somebody is really hardcore into the conspiracy side of things, they become very sort of start to be very, there's a term is just asking questions, where they will just repeatedly ask all these questions and then just be like, they'll say something absolutely ridiculous and just be like, well, I'm just asking questions here, you know, it makes you think. But by repeatedly asking these questions over and over, often the same one, just, you know, waiting a couple questions, repeating the question, they're just not interested in learning. You can tell pretty quickly. Versus somebody who is more interested in learning, they're going to be a little bit more open and a little more willing to actually continue the conversation without cutting you out off with questions and trying to distract with different things. And so those are the folks that you sort of just take that advantage and keep just gently sharing information and pointing to different sources. So you can tell most of the time, maybe I shouldn't be that confident. You can tell a lot of the time when somebody is genuinely willing to listen versus just being contrarian troll. Don't waste your time on the contrarian trolls. You're not going to get anywhere. Spend your time instead on the folks who might be on the fence listening to this conversation, as opposed to actively pushing back on it.
Yeah,
okay, that's super helpful advice.
Yeah, and so and that kind of builds on this notion of pre-bunking, and I picked on sort of. So do you think archaeology and archaeologists in some sense are a little bit at fault because we're not actually very good communicators about what it is we do sometimes? And you said, you know, there's a lack of access, which is something we've actually talked about on the show before, and that Gabe and I have kind of like been sort of spitballing about how do we sort of open up ways for people to do that. But that I find that, do you find that what you're seeing a lot of times with these people that are kind of fence sitting, it's that cool factor in what we do and the stuff that kind of grabs people's attention, like, so you know, failing apart from getting, you know, $1 million budget to produce a Netflix show about, you know, I don't know, shell heaps on south coast of Nova Scotia, with all those like you'd have some beautiful viewscapes and everything like that, but it's a lot of like trowel scraping. So like, are we a little bit at fault in the sense that we don't do a very good job of this pre-bunking because a lot of what we do is sort of trapped inside of this academic world? And like, how do you in your work push that out and find ways to communicate that and sort of do this pre-bunking just sort of through, you know, what you do?
Right. I do think that to some degree, yeah, we need to take responsibility as well. Absolutely, for our actions as archaeologists. It's not being good communicators over the years. There are some archaeologists who are just phenomenal communicators, who just really reach people. They're so engaging. You just really want to listen to them. And then there are other archaeologists who just aren't great communicators. And you're just 2 seconds into it, you're like, man, like your subject is so interesting, but oh my gosh, you're just not making me excited for it. I don't want to listen. And I think
would you care to name names, Stephanie? No.
Not at this time. But yeah, like I think that I really push for archaeologists to be willing to communicate, being willing to engage with pseudoarchaeology, not necessarily engage with the pseudoarchaeologists themselves or, you know, the people who believe it, engage with it in the sense of being willing to talk about it and discuss it and break things down. But yeah, I understand that not everybody enjoys communicating public communications either, and that's fine. Not everybody's good at it, to be completely honest. Some people are just terrible communicators generally. And that can have some really negative impacts as well. So we do have to, as much as what we have to think about what we say, we do have to think about how we're saying it. How we're saying it can have a very positive impact or very negative impact. And so social media is still a good place, I think, to communicate with folks, to get the information out. Twitter used to be a phenomenal place for it. Now it's not a phenomenal place for it. So we're still sort of searching for kind of something similar. TikTok is a good place. I personally keep an eye on what spaces are becoming popular, what are people flocking to, and what are people talking about, and start looking into, is that a good avenue to start to reach out to people and talk to people about different things. So yeah, trying on TikTok, YouTube is still a good place. I think TikTok's a little bit better, to be honest. But yeah, just watch where people are going and what people are starting to bring up as spaces that they're learning from, and start to use that as well.
So we've talked, I think, so far mostly about, I mean, at the beginning, not entirely, but mostly about parts of pseudoarchaeology that are not just overtly dark and overtly linked to white supremacist websites, to explicitly neo-Nazi ideologies and so forth. And I think that there's some distinction there. Maybe it's blurry, but for the one hopes the New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast listener has not had to go into some of the dark corners of the internet that you have, and I've certainly tried to avoid them. So I wonder if you could just maybe give the listener a sense of what the sort of down the road, really bleak, where is all of this going, pseudoarchaeology as the absolute darkest kind of nastiness that you've, maybe not the darkest. I feel like I've just set this up to be a real weird, like, look into man's soul and tell us the worst thing you've seen on the internet.
What made you cry today?
What was exactly what was your worst day on the internet?
Yeah, but the thing that you sent us a draft you're working on, and I was just struck by some of the legendarily bleak websites that you've had to spend time on, and wondered if you could sort of share why are we so worried about this? Where can this end up?
Right. Yeah. Even the most outlandish sounding thing. So like I always go for ancient aliens claims because they're so goofy sounding, right? Like aliens from Mars, or actually, sorry, Venus, more likely from Venus. I spend too much time reading this stuff, so I know there's a distinction between Martians and Venusians.
How do you tell? Asking for a friend.
Right, asking for a friend. How do you tell the difference? Well, there's a whole thing about the appearance of the different aliens, and are they reptilian, are they bird-like, are they grays, are they greens, or what are their names? The Dracos, do not trust the Dracos. That is something I've learned. And today I was reading through a newer cursed content book that I picked up recently, and I learned that raptors on Mars are descended from raptors on Earth. So,
no kidding.
Yeah, I know, right? The more you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah,
the ornithologists have been suppressing that, and I've just been missing all the opportunities.
Keeping that stuff.
Think about birding on Olympus Mons. That's
It sounds warm.
Yeah.
For cold, I'm not actually sure how it works. Yeah.
The avians, the blue avians are the good guys. I'll say that.
All right.
So blue avians seem to be okay. Yeah. So the stuff seems really goofy. It's really silly. But yet it ends up on hardcore websites, like far right websites like Stormfront, or Renegade Tribune, is one that I've looked at. The creativity guys are kind of weird dudes. Generally, they're all weird dudes. But the creativity,
and they are all dudes, listener. This is the other unfortunate side of this.
Yeah, there's a lot of dudes here,
and you can picture what they look like right now, like.
What they smell like is
heavy
what you'd be more worried about, I think.
Yeah, so much heavy breathing. Yeah, I don't want to discount the whirlwind. There's a fantastic, I'm just looking down right now. People can't see me looking down. I have a new book. If you want to learn more about the Dracos and the raptors on Mars, Fleet.
Dark Fleet.
It's a Nazi space program. The secret space program is a big thing in QAnon as well.
Oh.
Did not know that.
Linked to Nazi stuff. Yeah. But speaking of women on the far right, there's a new book. It's called The Women of the Far Right: Social Media Influencers and Online Radicalization by Evian Ledig. I might Ledig. I think I pronounced her name wrong. It's new. It's fantastic. So if you want to learn more about women specifically in the far right, it's a good space to look. Yeah. So anyway, the simple search for Atlantis, for example, took me onto this website, Renegade Tribune, which listeners do not look up this website. But it is a very alt history, conspiracy theory, far right website. I have found stuff on another website that is known for its Holocaust denialism and historical revisionism, which this one guy that I'm writing about in this paper as well has written this whole pseudoarch book about his ancient Aryans theories that literally starts off with Holocaust denialism. And then, yeah, looking at there's a movement called creativity. It's not a huge movement, but it's a pretty violent movement. Here, he's facing up to 35 years in prison for intimidating the jurors in the Tree of Life shooting trial that's on right now.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
that's the synagogue, right?
It is, yeah.
Yeah, okay, right.
And he's the one who was talking about how he uses a particular pseudoarch author's books to draw people into white supremacism. And he's made a lot of videos on BitChute in particular. There's some streaming, the BitChute and Rumble are similar to YouTube, except very far right favored. So he talks a lot on there. He makes videos about pseudoarch stuff. He's also a flat earther, which is another thing. That's the whole stigmatized knowledge aspect, where people who are into stigmatized knowledge, into one form of it, are likely to be drawn to other conspiracy theories as well, just through this unified idea of hidden truths and whatnot. So yeah, this stuff, it takes you into some pretty foul places, Stormfront being pretty awful, more so than a lot of the other places. I also spent a lot of time keeping an eye on if I see archaeologists being mentioned by far right people. Sometimes I will send them a message as well and just be like, hey, just a heads up, these folks on this website are talking about you, so you might get some nasty emails coming your way, that kind of thing. So yeah, it takes you into darker places than what you would think. I think if somebody just started talking about ancient aliens theories, you would be surprised to end up on a neo-Nazi website.
Yeah.
But it happens.
And it's all this related to, you mentioned in one of the things that because you've worked on a lot of things and I've been sort of working through them, so I'm going to miss where you mentioned this, but that there's a civilizationalist focused on, particularly on ancient sort of, this is kind of like all in quotes, so the listener can't see the air quotes, but it's all in quotes, on ancient advanced technologies, right? This idea that, well, you can't build pyramids because whatever reason, so it has to be aliens. And it seems like this just kind of naturally, if you're the sort of person that hangs out on Stormfront, follows that all of a sudden we have white aliens or something like that.
Yeah, it's like myth of the mound builders,
communities.
Like 21st century myth of the mound builders, basically, right?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. The mound builders are still very popular. I see mentions of mound builders pop up all the time. Yeah. Civilizationism, far right civilizationism. This author, Alexandra McFadden, she's talking about what is far right civilizationism. And so I'll just quote from what I've written of hers here, where the ideological concept of far right civilizationism is the notion of a superior and oftentimes white civilization. And it represents a community of mostly white, Western, and European unions or nations unified by what is viewed as highly advanced social, technological, and environmental facets. And so within the global far right anyway, historical revisionism is a really key characteristic. They're all really into that kind of thing. So when you have these guys that are proposing, or these folks who are proposing these theories, talking about these ancient, technologically advanced civilizations from Atlantis, for example, or maybe from Venus or whatever, that's going to catch the attention of somebody who's already looking for evidence of their own technologically superior white civilization. So when you look at the vast majority of pseudoarchaeological theories talk about advanced technology and advanced civilizations, and it's just, people who are looking for that are really going to glob onto it and see it as support for their own thing.
So as I've mentioned earlier, I'm basically a wuss. And so my response to often to pseudoarchaeology things, I've justified by saying that it's the old internet axiom that we talked about a little bit before we started, that, well, we just shouldn't feed the trolls, right? That if we're gonna amplify the wrong voices, all these kinds of things, which I've taken as part of my reason for deafening silence on social media. And also liking to be able to sleep at night. And so you also mentioned this idea of a backfire effect, and that there are questions of how to react to all of this. And so I guess I'm asking you to respond to the archaeologist like me who says, well, my response is that it's better just to let this bang around some fringy websites, people that already believe it. I can't convince them. And then if I engage with this, it's going to give it a certain seriousness. And the listener should know, depending on when this goes to air, this is sort of a prequel to, I guess it's going to be a Flint Dibble, Graham Hancock mix up
Showdown
on the Joe Rogan show or something to this effect. And that strikes, right? So it struck me as perhaps an example of chumming for troll, but I'm not really sure what the professional archaeologist reaction to all this should be.
Right. So I think that the whole Joe Rogan thing has actually been delayed. Flint is working on some health stuff. So it's been delayed until next year, I think, like next spring or something like that, last I saw. One thing I recommend everybody reads, there's this fantastic document. It's called Oxygen of Amplification. It's a 3-part PDF or article. It's in 3 PDFs. You can find it freely online if you just search the Oxygen of Amplification. It was a document that was originally written for journalists who report on the far right, the alt-right, agitators, that kind of thing, on basically how to essentially recognize when you should react versus not react, how to react, that kind of thing. So even though it was written for journalists, I recommend it to anybody who does any sort of front-facing communication type of work. It's really, really valuable. And excuse me, they talk a lot about essentially how to recognize rage farming, which is a very popular technique with far-right folks who, or general contrarian folks who just want to like get you into this frenzy, and they want to get people talking about things. They want to get people, really reacting to things, because that unintentionally spreads their message. So we might have the best intentions by reacting to things, but we have to think about, are we actually doing the work for these folks by spreading this around? Are we giving them more oxygen and amplification? And through that, you can learn about techniques on how to talk about things while trying to minimize the amount of amplification you give something. Because to some degree, any sort of reaction is going to be giving something a little bit more amplification than it would probably otherwise get. But things like, on social media, for example, instead of quote tweeting somebody, take a screenshot, block out the handles, and make it sort of a little bit more difficult to actually track down this person for your audience. Using, not really singling people out, but using perhaps what they're saying as an example of the bigger problem. You talk about the bigger problem. So you're not focusing your conversation on a person. They can't really take it personally and attack you for it, things like that. So I highly recommend people read that document or those PDFs. They're not really long reads, but they're very, very good reads. And then, learning, sometimes it is okay to just not, it's a better choice to not react to something. If somebody, you can tell somebody is rage farming, they're looking for that engagement, you have to stop and think, well, why do they want that engagement, and what am I going to do for them? And then just don't do it. And then other times, recognizing that the person who's making this really outlandish claim, you're probably not going to be getting through to them. So tailoring your conversation for the people on the sides, and again, sharing almost that pre-bunking information, letting people know what to look for. How do you know that what they're saying is incorrect, and filling in some incorrect knowledge or some incorrect information with more accurate information. You don't want to just debunk and leave all these holes. You want to actually be able to fill that in with stuff that the actual audience can take away. So there's been many occasions on social media in particular where I watch from the side. I would love to say something, but I know that those people are just looking for that really angry engagement or negative engagement, and I just don't want to give it to them. So I just, won't say anything. Reactions to Ancient Apocalypse were very much that way as well. There was a lot of rage farming for that. And the risk is what's called the backfire effect, where we're trying to debunk something. We're trying to let folks know how something is wrong or incorrect. And the backfire is that sometimes that can increase the engagement with that content in these fringe spaces. So we do have to be conscious of that as well, and think about, okay, we know that this long thread I'm going to write is going to amplify it to some degree. Where do I want that amplification to end up? Do I want it to be in these spaces, or do I want it to be sort of more that space? So again, starting with Oxygen of Amplification, really good space to start. And then think about communications based on that.
That's really helpful. And it's actually occurring to me as you go through this that we should maybe consider doing a podcast on sort of managing social media for the archaeologists. This would be an interesting topic.
something
Ken and I have a
neither of us
slight
are
allergy
particularly
to.
good at.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I only recently realized that the podcast Instagram was also posting directly to my Facebook, so I clearly have this well under
Yeah.
control.
And I don't have many social medias. Like I have never been on Twitter, and it's like I sort of am very proud of that in some ways, but I mean I've missed the entire point of it being helpful, and so now I can gladly say I didn't take part in it. But I know students talk about TikTok, and I know that there's a couple of like science communication. I was talking to one of the graduate student who's TAing my class right now, and she was saying that she works in permafrost research in the Arctic, and she said that climate change researchers have really taken advantage of TikTok as a way to sort of circulate factual information about climate change in a digestible format. So I don't know, Gabe, maybe we need to start dancing and talking about New Brunswick archaeology and videos or something.
Well, Ken, I remember this is probably the best piece of advice about the internet, which is that you should dance like no one's watching, but you should tweet like it one day may be subpoenaed. But so we're sort of wary about taking your entire evening. We're often a long form podcast here, and this conversation, I think we could kind of track this along forever. But I think we had one major thing we wanted to kind of ask you about, which is that you're doing a lot of Sorry, we have two major things we want to ask you about, actually. And sorry, we have
I only signed up for one.
Three major things. But Ken and I were very curious about if you could tell us how the internet algorithms work, roughly, to create or to accentuate this problem. And so one of the things that we had discovered, and Ken and I were discussing, was that we apparently are sort of alongside the Jordan Peterson hits, if you like Google this podcast, and we wondered to what degree is the internet kind of feeding this problem. We've already asked about the internet, but like the algorithms in particular are feeding this problem.
First of all, it froze for half a second. Can you guys am I still good on your side?
You're good.
You're back
Gabe,
now. Yeah.
Gabe talked through your frozen. So yeah. We came through to the other side.
So this is good. I've emerged, Ken, from our last podcast like a more confident me. I just plow on no matter what's happening. I'm like the Ken Holyoke of 2022.
It sounded like Skrillex on my side, and Skrillex is very popular. So if that helps you feel better.
That's my lispy New England accent. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, the internet algorithms. The algorithm, it varies a little bit too, depending on where you're at. So like the TikTok algorithm, for example, I'm thinking specifically more of social media thing. The TikTok algorithm is very different than the Instagram algorithm, which is very different than the Twitter algorithm. Mastodon has no algorithm. So depending on where you're at, the algorithm works a little bit differently. TikTok is particularly aggressive. You pause on a video for like half a second and suddenly they think that's all you want to see. And so for the next day, all you're going to get are videos of my shameful confession is farrier videos. I love watching farriers at work. And so I pause on half a video and be like, oh my God, look at the size of that horse's hoof. Massive. And now the next 40 videos are farriers.
Oh, wow.
Which is on one hand, okay, if you're really into farriers, that's cool. You get to see all these farrier videos, but then it's like, you might change your algorithm really quickly onto something. You make the mistake like I do of pausing on something about Lemuria, and suddenly all my farriers are gone, and I'm learning about fairies living in inner earth cities. So it's or sometimes I have intentionally tried to change my TikTok algorithm when I'm looking for something very specific, like Atlantis, for example. And I want to see what's going on with Atlantis on TikTok. And so I search Atlantis, and then I watch a video, and then I get nothing from Atlantis after that. And then it's just goofy cat videos. So it's TikTok algorithm is still a little bit mysterious, but it is more aggressive versus Instagram, which I don't even know how the heck the Instagram algorithm works. I see like a post that's like from 2 seconds ago, and then suddenly a post that's 3 days ago, and a post that's from the future even.
Instagram decided I was a Christian nationalist.
Oh no! Probably because you're white male.
About 2 months ago, and I live in southern Alberta too, right? So
that doesn't help.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, I'm a white male, and Instagram knows I just want to see cats in bodegas. It's fully aware.
I have heard about that though happening. I think who was it? Might even been my husband was saying all of a sudden he was getting some like weird stuff on Instagram too, where it was deciding he was like a particular type of guy.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's hard.
I shut it off for like 3 weeks and then came back, and it was back to there's a particular brand of t-shirt that's designed for dad bods that Instagram really, really wants me to buy. That's like it is my feed is just littered with that. And
sorry,
and
listener, we're gonna pause here. Ken's doorbell just rang, and there's what is that?
Oh,
is it,
another satisfied customer.
Now in blue.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then there's like Google as well, where Google you can use like search engine optimization, where you add certain keywords to like your podcast and stuff to pop up on Google. Or I remember hearing that like having a Facebook page for say your podcast, for example, helps in the Google searches as well. So I'm not an expert.
I don't think we do that.
We don't know.
I don't know how true that is anymore, because Google has also been changing. So yeah, I don't know. I'm definitely not an expert in internet algorithms, but there is some really interesting stuff out there about it. A lot of researchers I've seen on like TikTok and Twitter and stuff, or I should say used to see them before Twitter got all messed up. There is a lot of really interesting information on how algorithms feed into certain stuff, especially like on YouTube, where essentially conspiracy theory videos sell. It makes a lot of money for YouTube, which is why they're constantly pushing it into your feeds. I'm trying to remember, there was a really good docuseries I watched. I think it was the one about Sherry Shriner, who she had like this sort of internet cult going on, and it was very based in like evil reptilians and stuff. There was a docuseries a couple of years ago, and there's this one fantastic episode in the series where they had this French researcher talking about how algorithms work, in particular on YouTube, and how conspiracy theory videos sell. It makes YouTube a lot of money, which is why they're constantly pushing it into your feeds.
There's that sort of horrifying documentary, The Social Dilemma, that came out a couple of years ago, and it was all these people that were like the initial like programmers and crafters of all these social media algorithms, and they were just like, oh, it's gotten totally out of hand. I mean, it's like it's beyond anything that we can control. We've created monsters. And they're all like, but we've made like $1 billion, and now I live in a glass hut at the top of a mountain, and I'm practicing on myself now. It's like,
yes, I have 3 vacation houses and 5 Teslas.
Yeah. Well, at the beginning of that question, I was thinking we should stop just sending around the show notes as mimeographed copies that we mailed to our Christmas card list, and now I'm back to thinking we should do that. So I've been chomping at the bit to ask about Brother 12, but I feel like I should give Ken an opportunity if he has any more questions before we jump into just letting you riff on Brother 12.
No, I think let's learn about Brother 12, because I have been since I saw, and I was like, when I first read it, I was like, Brother XII, and I was like, no, it must be Brother 12, and I was like, what is this Brother? And there's the society that he's part of, and so I went on like a Wikipedia hole, and then I was it's the
Naima bars that are solid gold, which is exciting.
That's right.
Yeah. So I've had my lips wetted, and now I'm excited to hear more about Brother 12. So do proceed.
So yeah, people already know something very tragic, that he looks a lot like Jordan Peterson does. So there's that. So now listeners have this idea in their mind. When I'm saying Brother 12, just think of Jordan Peterson. Probably cried just as much as Jordan Peterson does. So
the all beef diet, it's a real slog, listener. I don't
right. Just hits you right in the gut, literally. So Brother 12, he was obviously not born as Brother 12. He was born as Edward Arthur Wilson in 1878, England. And his whole thing, the Brother 12 era, we're talking about like the mid 1920s to mid 1930s. It was very fast. It was very short lived. A lot of these things, culty things, often are. He was raised as a member of the Catholic Apostolic Church. They were also known as the Irvingites. And later he was angry at the church. And if you read some of his writing later, he felt that they sort of had pulled a bit of a wool over his eyes and denied him a truth for a very long time, that he felt he could have gotten into sooner. So he was eventually excommunicated as an adult. He was excommunicated from the church. And he got really into what's called theosophy, which is a spiritual movement. It's now very related to New Age spirituality. It's the root of a lot of New Age spirituality. It's still pretty popular. Claims came through theosophy. Atlantis got popularized through theosophy. It's quite related to a lot of pseudoarchaeological stuff.
Is theosophy also it's the Waldorf school movement as well, isn't it?
I don't know.
Oh, interesting.
I don't know
okay.
that actually.
Yeah.
And so Theosophy, when the time Brother 12 joined, Theosophy was kind of changing a little bit. So Theosophy was co-founded by this woman, Helena Blavatsky. It was her books, The Secret Doctrine, Isis Unveiled, that were like the foundations of Theosophy. But she had died, and the new leaders of the Theosophical movement or society were making some changes, and a lot of Theosophists weren't happy with these changes. Brother 12 being one of them. So he left, and he really advocated, going back to Blavatsky's teachings. He was like a hardcore Blavatsky fanboy. And part of theosophy is this idea of the ascended masters. They are these ethereal beings that live on this other plane of consciousness, and they have all the knowledge of the world. They originally came from Atlantis. When Atlantis sunk, these dudes started the mystery schools afterwards, where they taught all of this sacred knowledge that Atlanteans had. They were very special people, the Atlanteans. So a lot of essentially Brother 12's whole thing comes down to knowledge from Atlantis. And so he woke up one night, it was 1924. He woke up actually over a series of 3 nights and learned that the Ascended Masters had this big task for him, that he was going to transition humanity into the 6th subrace of the 5th root race, which was also the Age of Aquarius. Probably the most famous concept of theosophy that people know about is the root races. Right? Yeah. Every time I'm like writing Brother 12 stuff, I'm thinking of that song. The root races are like the most important concept of theosophy, I think. So it's this idea of humanity has passed through these series of evolutions, spiritual, physical evolutions over millions and millions and millions of years, starting with the first root race. Each root race has 7 sub-races, and there are 7 root races total. At Brother 12's time, they were living in the 5th root race. The 6th and 7th were going to be in the future. And essentially, you start with the Polarian root race. They evolved into the Hyperborean root race, who evolved into the Lemurians, who evolved into the Atlanteans. And then the 5th root race, which was the greatest and best of them all, was the Aryan root race. This stuff got quite connected into certain elements of Nazi Germany as well. So Brother 12 believed that he would be transitioning humanity into the 6th subrace of that Aryan root race, also the Age of Aquarius. So he started up the Aquarian Foundation, this like movement / cult, where a lot of rich people joined and gave all their money to support this work. And eventually the Ascended Masters told him that he had to go to southern British Columbia to actually begin the work of transitioning humanity, because British Columbia was ideal for bodybuilding. Which is both spiritual and literally physical. They also refer to literal bodybuilding. So, which is a big part of the manosphere today. Like a lot of this stuff.
I was going to say there's a
stuff.
weird like throughput to the alt-right stuff today too, isn't there?
Oh, for sure. I think if Brother 12 was alive today, he would be totally right in front of those like testicle tanning machines.
He'd be selling supplements.
For sure. Absolutely. Door to door.
As long as there's no problem with my all beef diet. That's
yeah, he actually, you had to be vegetarian if you wanted to really do good work, but
well,
he was just
not everyone can be right about the gains all the time, I guess.
No. That's right. So he moves his organization to southern BC, and they set up their first property, their first settlement on Vancouver Island, in this little area called Cedar by the Sea, and that was going to be the headquarters. So the Aquarian Foundation had chapters, actually just small chapters all around the world. They had New Zealand, Sweden, England, several very active chapters in the United States as well. So you didn't actually have to be in BC. And also the BC locations were invite only. So you could be really active in the external chapters, but perhaps Brother 12 or his board of governors could invite you to actually move to BC to help with the actual work. So they ultimately ended up setting up 3 settlements for sure, on Vancouver Island, De Courcy Island, Valdez Island. And I recently found out that they were also potentially building on a 4th island, but I'm still trying to confirm that. And each island had a specific purpose, because it turns out the Aquarian Foundation had 2 core purposes. One was to transition humanity into the 6th subrace and the Age of Aquarius. And that was work that was happening on De Courcy and Valdez Island. On Vancouver Island was the outer work, it was called. And that was for specifically revealing the truth to the world that a secret cabal of Jews and Catholics were controlling the world and seeking world domination. So that was the other goal of the Aquarian Foundation, was to get that information out any way they could. And so Brother 12 was really into like some pretty hardcore anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, and he wrote a lot about it in his magazines. The Aquarian Foundation had a magazine that they published monthly for 1 year called The Chalice. And that's where you see a lot of this conspiracism come out, the New Age spirituality come out. And Brother 12 and the Aquarian Foundation were very what's called conspiritual. So conspirituality is a concept that refers to ideologies and worldviews that are built from a combination of New Age spirituality and conspiracy theories. QAnon, again, elements of QAnon are a big part of it. And actually a lot of stuff that Brother 12 was into, elements of QAnon are really into it as well. So much stuff in his magazine. I'll be reading his magazine. I'll be like, oh yeah, I saw this QAnon dude say exactly that on Twitter the other day.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, very like there's this long continuity. And so a lot of people, conspirituality is starting to gain attention now through things like QAnon, but its history is really not very well understood. And the people the academics who came up with the term conspirituality, they talk about how it's largely a post-1990s internet movement, but that pre-internet history and how conspirituality manifests off the internet in real life there's not information known about that. Not very much information known about it. So Brother 12 is a really good example of historic conspirituality and how it does manifest off the internet. What does it actually look like? So a lot of my research is looking at his conspirituality in his magazines, his articles, his books, and then thinking, how did they put it into practice? What were they building? How were they organizing themselves? How did they, alter their landscapes to manifest this conspirituality? So Brother 12 and the Aquarian Foundation moved to BC in 1927. And then by 1933, the whole thing had fallen apart because his disciples actually took him to court twice. Once in 1928, when they claimed that I guess it was sort of like he was stealing money from them. So everybody was expected to give him essentially all their money. If you were invited to come live in BC, you had to give all your money because you had to be focused on the work and not, your material possessions. And the idea was that he would use this money to buy properties and supplies and stuff in the name of the Aquarian Foundation. Turns out when he bought De Courcy and Valdez, he bought it under his own personal name, not the Aquarian Foundation's name. And also he was taking a woman into his house of mystery, which was a very sacred space. That's where he channeled the Ascended Masters. And he was taking this woman who he claimed was a reincarnated Isis. He was reincarnated Osiris. And they were channeling together in the house of mystery. And this is like 1928, so it was very, it was immoral and
I think that's
stuff.
The title of the episode, Channeling Together in the House of Mystery.
Excellent.
Yeah, I think
title.
you're right. Yeah.
So the disciples took Brother 12 to court. He fired back that actually the whole thing started. He took the Aquarian Foundation secretary to court. He claimed the secretary was stealing money. The secretary was like, dude, I'm actually just taking what you owe me for my work. By the way, you're actually stealing money. And so anyway, Brother 12 won this court case because the secretary disappeared partway through the trial. So the whole thing was dropped.
Disappeared or was disappeared?
I don't know. Remains to be seen.
I'm just asking questions, Stephanie.
Of course. Yes. Yeah. It really makes you think.
Yeah.
Yeah, he did talk about, Brother 12 did talk about ethereally assassinating people. The idea was that you would assassinate their spirit, and then eventually their body would die. But maybe he just skipped the spirit part with Robert Englund. I don't know.
Yeah, the rest of us discovered grad school for that purpose, but they.
So that was the first court case, and then Brother 12 wins, and they're still doing their thing. And then the second court case came up in 1932 for the same reason. The disciples were like, dude, you're still stealing money from us. We're not actually doing anything. Like, you promised us all this grand work was going to happen. It's just not happening. So, the disciples never stopped believing in the work. They just stopped believing that he could lead the work. Also, they were being treated like absolute shit by him and his then partner, who was not the same House of Mystery lady. This was a new mystery lady. Madam Z, her name was. So the disciples took him to court again, and in this case they won because he and Madam Z fled, disappeared. He went and died a few years later. And so that is essentially the Brother 12 story. But the popular side of the story is, as we mentioned, or alluded to, is the hidden gold, because he would often ask people when they were giving him money to give him money in bars of gold or coins of gold, and he would store them around the properties as the stories go. So a lot of the popular stories are...
For the listener, bars of gold are Bitcoin of the 1920s. The far right Bitcoiners were far right gold people back in the day. Although I think there's still gold,
Exactly.
Gold and silver, I think, is still a thing, isn't it? That's
yeah.
I think gold
actually,
buggery is still a thing
today.
on the alt-right. Yeah.
It is. Yeah, for sure. Along with all the same anti-Semitism and anti-Catholicism and all this stuff, Freemasonry stuff. So, so everybody knows about the gold, or locally people know about the stories of the hidden gold, and that's what's been popularized in books and shows and stuff. But nobody ever asks why he asked for gold. Like, why wouldn't he just keep his money in the bank? And that's where I come in as the nerd, and I say the more interesting story is that why question, and it's because he didn't trust the banks because he thought they were being controlled by Jews. And so that conspiracist element is really, really interesting. And the starkest example of his conspiracism are the gun forts. He ordered gun forts to be built around at least two of the properties.
Subtle.
Very, very subtle. And what's interesting, at least for me, is so there was the Vancouver Island property was the conspiracist property. That was reserved for people who were doing the work of exposing the cabal of Jews and Catholics. De Courcy and Valdez were the spiritual islands. That's where the work for transitioning humanity was happening. But the gun forts were built on De Courcy and Valdez and not on Vancouver Island, at least not that we know of. So it's kind of interesting as to thinking about why did he build these conspiracist elements on the spiritual islands, but not on the other conspiracist island. So by 1932, he was already stockpiling guns in 1927. 1932, he ordered these stone gun forts to be built as protection against the government. Which government? I don't know. The Canadian government was keeping their eye on him, but also this cabal might have been watching him.
Presumably the globalists was what he said.
Yes,
the World
that's
Economic
right.
Forum, isn't that? Isn't it? Yeah.
Yep, exactly.
The League of
so
Nations.
I think that's... Oh, he does talk about the League of Nations.
Oh, yeah?
Oh, for sure. Of course he does. All these, literally all these very popular far right conspiracy theories today you can find examples of in his writings. It's wild.
Fascinating.
He also tried to interfere with a presidential election. In 1928, the American presidential election was on, and the Democratic nominee, Alfred Smith, was a Catholic. I think it was the first Catholic Democratic nominee that there was. Brother 12, obviously being anti-Catholic, did not like that. So he actually attempted to form a third party called the Protestant Protective League to get a third presidential or third party nominee in Thomas Heflin, who was considered as an unofficial spokesperson for the KKK. He was not a good person. And so obviously Brother 12 loved him. And so Brother 12, through the Protestant Protective League, actually networked a little bit with the KKK and the militant Freemasons to get this word out against Catholics and this cabal that was happening, to try to disrupt that presidential election, which didn't end up happening. So yeah, the Brother 12 story is kind of wacky. And then when he fled, when he and Madam Z fled as well, can't confirm it was him, but somebody essentially tried to destroy one of the properties, and rumors have it was Brother 12 on his way out, blew up his own ship, tore down a bunch of structures, that kind of thing.
Oh wow. And this is the subject of your dissertation.
It is, yes. Looking at how a few different elements, like looking at that pseudoarch, like I mentioned, a lot of this information that he based his beliefs on were allegedly came from Atlantis. So, thinking about that pseudoarch influence on his life, but then also looking at this element of conspirituality, and because it's largely considered today as an internet-based thing, looking at how it actually manifests off the internet. How does it impact people's lives? And then also looking at his impact on indigenous sites as well. They built on top of a couple of their settlements were partially on top of archaeological sites, First Nations archaeological sites. And they incorporated that a little bit into the New Age side of their beliefs. But they also used actual archaeological material, shell midden, as a construction material. So they made their own concrete on De Courcy Island. Valdez, I'm still looking into, but they made their own concrete and they used shell midden from the sites within that concrete. So I'm also kind of interested in beyond just the practical element, because it was a decent aggregate. Was there also a spiritual element as well to the use of that shell midden? And today, conspiritual groups, far right groups, pseudoarchs, they also have impacts on First Nations archaeological sites intellectually, but physically as well. So that's also part of it.
I'm really looking forward to reading this dissertation and
totally, and
the resulting book. So
yeah, exactly. So are you going to go and actually do some field work at the sites themselves? Yeah. Oh wow.
I am. Yeah. So 3 islands. The fourth one I still have to figure out, but so one of the islands, the Vancouver Island property, not much to do there. Like I'm really interested in the spatial organization.
Yep.
So I'll just go, handheld GPS and start marking out some stuff. On De Courcy, I'd like to use LiDAR because there are some elements, some stuff there that are really overgrown by like salal and shrub that I'd like to get a clearer view of. And also just try to find more of the gun forts. I've seen one that's sort of still standing. I know where another one was. There was a third one somewhere. I don't know where that is, but also just curious, are there other stuff around? And again, to like map out some stuff, also make some 3D models. I'd like to do some like terrestrial LiDAR, make some 3D models. And then on Valdez Island, there's no standing structures. So De Courcy and Cedar, there are still standing cabins and houses and whatnot. Valdez, there aren't, but there is, we know at least one cabin foundation outline is there. So I'd like to go excavate and get an idea of the layout of the cabin, what kind of material goods are in there. And then again, use LiDAR, maybe some GPR, see if I can find the footprints of the other cabins that were built there and get an idea of layout, and also look for more gun forts.
Fascinating. That sounds like really kind of totally trippy, but really fun field work. Like
it really does. Well, Ken, my beady reptilian eyes are looking at a half-finished bottle of Courvoisier, and I don't know about you, but this skin is really starting to scrape against my lizard skin, and so we've kept Stephanie up. I think probably rather late, and so I wonder if we should call it.
I think so. And Stephanie, thank you so much for coming on. This was
thank you.
This was a great conversation, and the Brother 12 thing. I'm going to be like thinking about. I can't wait till you start getting stuff out on this, because just
Absolutely.
like it's totally bizarre, but like so cool. Like it's just, and I mean yeah. So this whole story is kind of great, and thank you for sharing all the information you have, and for also the work that you're doing. Just as being kind of a public figure about pseudoarchaeology and kind of being out there and doing the work that people like me that just don't really want to engage with in any conducive or constructive way. But and so
your website and your Twitter handle, I think.
Yeah.
Can we get that one more time?
Yep. So bonestonesandbooks.com. That's all one word, and then at cult CULT_archaeo ARCHAEO at cult_archaeo. That's the X or Twitter handle. So you can find all Stephanie's stuff, and you can find her Sapiens article online that would be open as well. And
we'll
so
put in the show notes too.
Link it in the show notes, and we might link a couple of the articles that you'd mentioned as well. The what was it? The oxygen of amplification.
The oxygen amplification. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll find the link. I'll send you the link to it.
Oh, awesome. Thanks.
That's fantastic. So thank you again, Stephanie, for coming from the other coast to the New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast.
Yes. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for joining us from west of the Rockies. We really appreciate it.
We do exist west of the Rockies. Yes, thank you so much for having me and for letting me blabber on about a whole bunch of different things, but especially Brother 12. Man, he's so weird, and I love talking about Brother 12.
So honestly, Ken and I this earlier we were texting about having you on, and Ken basically texted, have you been reading this Brother 12 stuff? And I said yes, as I had the Wikipedia article and the string of things open about him. So
yeah, he's a weird story.
Yeah, very cool. So thanks again, Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Stephanie.
Have a great night.
Thanks, guys. You too.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
I think it's time for hit pieces.
That's right, Ken. We've got some a number of it's been a really good year, I think, for hit pieces.
It has.
In the Northeast, we've got a bunch of good publications, and so I'm sort of thrilled to introduce this one because it's by Al Honsinger as the lead author, with Arthur Anderson, second author, and me as the last author. And part of the thrill here is that Al Honsinger was a grad student of mine who was also in the field with me down east. And anytime, as you know, I think from having the experience of turning part of your thesis into a publication, is that this is the ideal cycle, right? And so Al has just had out in Archaeology of Eastern North America. That's the 2023 edition. So that's volume 51, page 95 to 107. Lithic procurement in the Quaddy region, Washington County, Maine, a view from the Roasting Falls site. And so in this paper, Al uses thin section petrography, X-ray powder diffraction, low power microscopy, and high resolution digital photography of a bunch of lithics from the intertidal zone at Roasting Falls to basically point out that most of the lithic material from Middle Woodland is very local. How local, you may ask? It is so local that I was walking over, apparently, a likely lithic procurement area for several years before Al joined the project, whomped it with a rock hammer, thin sectioned that sucker, and found out that, yep, same rock.
Same rock. Very cool.
So very well done, Al. And Al is currently, he's going to be studying a PhD at UMass Amherst, right after Christmas, but is currently an archaeologist for VTrans.
That's fantastic.
Which is the Vermont transportation. It's the highways for Vermont, whatever the whatever
DOT
the
or whatever.
is. Yeah,
So
exactly.
congratulations to Al. That's great. Publishing your thesis is a fantastic achievement, and pretty soon after he finished too, eh? Like he only finished a year or so ago.
That's right. Yeah, he was a pandemic. He wrote his thesis during the pandemic, and great credit to him, I think, and turned it out real well. And we love to see this outcome.
That's perfect. So the next one up here is another hit from the far northeast. So this is Catherine Patton, who's at University of Toronto, Arthur Anderson at University of New England, and David Black, who is an honorary research professor. Is that his title?
I think it is, yeah. At
University of New Brunswick. It's called The Most Delicious Fish, Toward a Zooarchaeology of the Green Sea Urchin, Strongliocentrotus drobachiensis on the coastal northeast of North America. And that's in the Journal of Island and Coastal Archaeology. And that just came out this year. I think it was published online in June, or it was accepted in June. I think it just went up online about a month or two ago. And this is an article that looks at the distribution of green sea urchin in shellfish assemblages from ancestral Wabanaki sites, and in particular from the Quaddy region of New Brunswick and Maine, which is the traditional homeland of the Pescoda-Makati. And so this paper draws on historical, ecological, and archaeological data to argue that sea urchins were harvested at specific points in the annual tidal cycle, and it suggests that the abundance of sea urchin in archaeological collections probably changed through time, reflecting changes in local environment, climate changes, and the changing ways that Pescotomacati were living on the landscape at that time. So that's a really great article, and it's in the Journal of Island and Coastal Archaeology. And then our next one,
KP, Arthur, and Dave. That's a great paper, and it's sort of cool. That kind of riffs on. They've been doing a lot of good work with column samples from shell bearing sites.
That's right, yeah,
and a lot of really detailed work looking, basically screening shell middens and shelves through increasingly
graduated
small mesh.
sieves.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep. So yeah, I was Catherine was actually just starting to go through those column samples when I was sort of packing my stuff up in the lab at U of T. So
cool. Yeah. They have not gone crazy as far as we know yet, listener. They're not shaking sieves and sort of you put the lime in the coconut and then doing a little maraca thing with the sieves.
Well, it does help get it down through the especially when you get down to 1/16 and smaller. That's always
true.
Nice.
Yeah.
And this one is an article that I found in the popular culture. This is not New Brunswick archaeology or even far northeastern archaeology. It is actually Eastern archaeology of the old world, and is a topic near and dear to Gabe's heart, actually. And that is that
not just my heart.
At Karahan Tepe is a Mesolithic temple in Turkey. They've actually discovered one of the largest and oldest statues in depicting an anthropomorphic person, and so this is a gentleman standing quite tall and groping a very graphic phallus. In fact, the first article that I clicked on included no pictures of the statue, presumably to preserve the dignity of the reader. But I caught this caught my eye, and I sent it to Gabe in part because Gabe has actually published a paper with David Black on the distribution of phallic effigies in the far northeastern.
Let's not exclude him.
Phallic effigies in the archaeological record. However, these ones actually date quite some time ago. The site is somewhere around close to 11,500 years old. And so this is significant just because of the monumental architecture and the sort of largesse and the oldest human statue of its kind found to date, which is kind of neat.
So Ken, would you say the article's about a long time ago? Well, whatever it was, it took a deft hand to pull off. That's the important. That's the important thing. And so Ken, the other thing I think we're gonna plug was the Eastern States Archaeological Federation is coming up. We've been sort of traveling through time as we do these, but basically starting the week of October 25th, a bunch of students and I and other archaeologists will be on an expedition to Ocean City, Maryland, to the Eastern States Archaeological Federation meeting, and we're hopefully going to have some we're calling it live content or short pieces from ESAF. The ESAF meeting is always fun, and it's one of I think the great things with ESAF is it really is one of the last sort of meetings that's got CRM, academic, and avocational archaeologists all at the same meeting, really sharing a bunch of good information. And it's just always a blast. And so I'm really looking forward to that. And we'll have some updates for the listener from live from Ocean City.
Yeah. And so when the listener hears this episode, it will be airing as Gabe and his colleagues and students are ensconced in academic learning in Ocean City.
That's absolutely right. Not Ocean City, New Jersey, but Ocean City, Maryland.
Yeah, which I'm guessing is in a similar state of decay, but probably still has some redeeming aspects.
Yeah, well, the hotel price would be one of them, which is well south of what I expected it to cost. So.
even with the exchange rate, it's affordable.
Yeah, it was funny. I emailed our dean of arts asking for a little money to pay for undergraduate hotel rooms, and you could tell from the first paragraph he had this thought that no, it's going to be a big ask. And then when I asked for $220, there was a sort of you could feel the sigh of relief through the email where he said, "I don't think that'll be a problem, Gabe."
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah,
well,
and
listener,
I
I
think
think Ken and I are looking at a half-finished bottle of Courvoisier.
yep. And I don't know, like I mean, it might have been finished 2 days ago for where we are in the flat circle of time right now.
Yeah. I think, listener, what you've been listening to is Ken and I in real time deciding that we are not in real time and we should be.
And it is really time to sign off. And and so we hope you enjoyed this episode, and stay tuned for the next fortnight where you're going to get a sequel where we're going to explore more about pseudoarchaeology, and we hope that this topic actually generates some buzz with the listenership, and we look forward to reading emails from you about maybe even some of your favorite stories or myths that you maybe have heard about archaeology in the province, and if you've got questions about those, and perhaps we can answer them.
That's right. And thank you, listener. And thanks very much to Stephanie Halmhofer for being our guest of honor this pod. And we will see you in a fortnight with Daryl Kelman.
Yeah, and safe travels to ESAF, Gabe, and have lots of fun this week.
Thanks, Ken. You don't need to worry about that. We'll talk to you soon.
All right. Bye, listener.
Have a good night.